Buried while black. Yeah, so my project is a little bit different. It's not the traditional project, um, and I'm not following sort of like the traditional PowerPoint um presentation. Um, but I think it is very interesting, and it kind of just started off as an investigation that's related to my personal research into my family's history. So, yes, the title is Buried While Black, and it's focusing on Payne Cemetery, which is in Washington, D.C. But before I go down this screen, I'll start with a little bit of a backstory to kind of explain how I got to this point of researching into Payne Cemetery. So for I'd say more than 10 years, and I'm pretty young, I've been interested in family history and research. So it was something that I started doing with my dad, and he kind of passed it on to me. So a lot of times in my spare time, I do research on Ancestry and other sites like most people, well, a lot of people typically do. Um, but if you've ever done research on any of those sites, it can, that can be very rewarding when you find information that connects dots or connects pieces together. But it can also be very frustrating when you reach a dead end on a certain person. So this project started with me researching my great grandmother. Her name was Nellie West Gant. And I did not know too much about her. She was one of those people that I reached a roadblock on, and that was because of a number of reasons, but I reached a roadblock on her. So I wanted to dig more into Nellie West. I wanted to know, like, who are her parents? Does she have siblings? I wanted to know why she died so young, because she died fairly early, in my opinion. Probably around her 40s is when she passed away. So I wanted to just know more about her. So being that I do ancestry research, I dig around different websites, go through newspaper clippings, and not too long ago I found a obituary on her that said the typical obituary stuff. It said, which hospital she passed away at. It said which cemetery she was buried in, listed her children, etc. And I never thought anything of it, but as I wanted to learn more about her, I decided to dig more into the hospital and the cemetery. Unfortunately, I learned during this process that the hospital she was buried at, which is called Freedmen's Hospital in DC, which is now Howard University Hospital. I called them, they only maintained records for 10 years. So her records were obviously destroyed since she passed away in the 40s. And then I wanted to look into Payne Cemetery because that was the next on the list. And to my disappointment, Payne Cemetery was torn down in the 60s. So I wouldn't be able to use that as a way to kind of find more about Nellie West. But that I began interested in how can a cemetery just be torn down? That was I was caught off guard by that, because to me, a cemetery should be like a sacred place. And this is just my great grandmother. It's not like my great 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 grandmother. So I was just like, it was odd to me that cemetery was gone at that point. But with that being said, I decided to keep researching and do a little bit more digging into the cemetery to learn more about why this happened, what was the process like, figure some things out about that. So that is what my project is about. It's about Payne Cemetery, and we're calling it Buried While Black. The disinterment of historically Black cemetery in Washington, D.C. So I'll just give a little bit of backstory on the cemetery itself, its origins. Payne Cemetery was created in 1851 by a freed Black man named John Payne. This was created during a time that DC was expanding. Obviously, it was growing, and looking at the numbers, in the early 1800s, there was only about 4,000 Black people in DC, and obviously with time and a lot of changes, that number grew. So in the 1880s, that the number of Black people in DC reached about 60,000 people. But with that, with the growth, obviously there was a need for more cemeteries, particularly Black cemeteries, due to segregation and a lot of other racial disparities. So at the time, Payne Cemetery was ranked within the top 5 of Black cemeteries, so it was pretty successful. I don't know if that's a good thing. It's a cemetery to be successful, but it was one of the big 5 cemeteries in DC at the time. And so those big 5 included Columbian, Harmony, Payne's, Mount Olivet, Mount Zion, and Mount Pleasant. One thing that's interesting is right across the street from where Payne Cemetery was located, there was a interracial cemetery named Woodlawn Cemetery. So those 2 cemeteries represented sort of a spectrum of the community. So Woodlawn Cemetery was integrated, and more wealthy people were able to use Woodlawn Cemetery, whereas more people who were in poverty went to Payne Cemetery. But still, it was one of the #1 cemeteries at that time. So skipping over, fast forwarding, just to make sure we're on time, to about 1961, Payne Cemetery was purchased by a real estate developer named Lewis Bell. So at that time, Lewis Bell, he was kind of just acquiring a lot of abandoned, locations and places in the area. So I didn't mention this, but Payne Cemetery definitely saw a decrease. So although it was very well off in the early or the late 1800s, over time, they just couldn't keep up with the work, since it was kind of, I guess you can say, a small business, but they just really couldn't keep up. They couldn't keep up the maintenance, a lot of things. So at that time, Lewis Bell purchased the property, and he decided to transfer the bodies from Payne Cemetery from DC to not too far, but to Prince George's County. He had a cemetery there also that he owned, which was called National Harmony Memorial Park Cemetery. And so he decided to move the bodies from Payne to Harmony. But there was a bit of controversy related to this transfer of bodies. So the community was not very happy about this process. And I'll show some examples about that as well. But before I do that, I'll note that the community expressed their grievances with the movement of the bodies, and they also kind of expressed that the process wasn't done in a good job. In 1966, they had to go back and move an additional 2,000 graves from Payne to Harmony. So that just tells you that the first time they went about this, they didn't really do a good job doing it. So it was a very interesting time in regards to that. But like I said, the community did express their frustrations. And I think some of these clippings in the paper are interesting. So in the Evening Star paper, there's a segment called Action Line. And so I'll just click this, but basically readers were able to kind of like write in their problems, and I guess a researcher at the newspaper would respond back to it after digging into it. So here's one of the articles. So someone was calling in about, they're referring to Payne, but a graveyard that was torn up, and they haven't let us know anything about it. And this person's mother was there, but she knew nothing about like the cemetery being like transferred to a different location. So she did get a response. I guess someone from the health department gave some information, but they explained that they moved the body to Harmony, explained where it was. What's interesting here is they mentioned that there was some sort of advertisement in the paper about the process that was being done. The judge thought it was odd that there was no opposition to this process happening, so he also told them to advertise it again, and there was only one opponent, so they just proceeded with, going forward with the process. And a spokesperson from Harmony Cemetery, which is where the bodies were relocated to, also noted that down here, he says that the bodies were simply deposited into a single pit. I found that a little bit disturbing, but so all the bodies were transferred from Payne Cemetery and just pretty much dropped at Harmony Cemetery into like one single location. So very interesting. So yeah, the community was a little bit upset. And as far as the process goes, like some things just probably weren't done in the best way. Someone here was complaining about the job of moving the bodies. They know that there were human bones. Sorry if this is gruesome. Human bones and skulls and caskets laying in the street. Just really a really bad job. But the response that they got back was that there were children. They said that there were children who were, playing jokes and scattering, these things in the street. So it's so bizarre to me how this entire process was. So yeah, a lot of community feedback related to the cemetery and the process of it. Yes, but moving on, after the cemetery was, the bodies were transferred to Prince George's County. Eventually, Payne Cemetery was replaced by a middle school and a recreation center. So it was replaced with Fletcher Johnson Middle School and Recreation Center in 1978. But this isn't the only cemetery that kind of endured a similar fate in DC. The Columbian Harmony Cemetery, which was one of those top 5 cemeteries in the 1800s, it also was purchased by Louis Bell. And the bodies were also transferred to Harmony Cemetery. And today, that is Rhode Island Avenue Metro Station. Louis Bell once he moved everything, he sold the land for $3.5 million. And he sold Payne Cemetery for 1.5. And he also tried to do a similar thing with the cemetery across the street from Payne, which is Woodlawn Cemetery. But he didn't kind of follow through with that. And this article right here kind of explains how he moved to Florida. So I don't know, something bizarre, but he didn't follow through with Woodlawn Cemetery, so that is still there. So yeah, essentially it was pretty interesting to do the research on the cemetery and learn some of the things about the history of DC and how these historic cemeteries are kind of not cared for and just erased over a certain amount of time. But while my research, as I wanted to learn more about Payne Cemetery, I was able to go to the DC library, the Martin Luther King Jr. Library in DC, and find some documents related to Payne Cemetery. So they actually have a ledger, and I'll try to open it. Yeah, so this is actually a ledger from the cemetery. If you turn your head sideways, you can see it says 7/20/32, so 1932 to April 20th, 1952. Obviously, the cemetery was created way before that, but this ledger just is related to that time frame. And luckily for me, well, I have to say luckily for me, but my great grandmother did pass away in that time frame, so I was able to find her in the ledger. Um, this is probably too small, so I tried to get it in a separate window, but I was able to find Nellie Gant, which is her married name. So it was rewarding for me that I was able to find like her cause of death because I never knew. It's diabetic something, I'm not really sure. But this does confirm that she passed away at Freedman's Hospital. And yeah, so it was just a little bit rewarding to find this sort of information on my great grandmother since I wasn't able to find anything in the past related to her for the most part. But also, one thing that's interesting is there is a map of the cemetery as well that lays out all the sections and graves, and just like maps of the city in DC. It's hard to see, but this green area right here was Payne Cemetery. So I was able to find some information about the cemetery that I found interesting. And in this sort of website thing that I made, using story maps, I kind of just show where the cemetery, oop, didn't mean to click that. Yeah, it's like an interactive thing. So it shows where the cemetery is today, what it looks like today. So you can see here, there's like a school here, Fletcher Johnson Middle School. Right across the street, this would be Woodlawn Cemetery. And then I also show where the cemetery was relocated to, which is National Harmony Cemetery, which is in Prince George's County, but not too far from the original location. Yeah, in this next section, I kind of wanted to just talk about like burial cultures and traditions a little bit. I don't want to take up too much time, but I just wanted to kind of like conclude things here. So obviously I know that, thinking about it logically, we can't maintain every cemetery that's ever created in history. That just wouldn't be sustainable and friendly for the environment. Obviously, things have to change and evolve over time. But I think it is important to respect burial cultures and traditions. Everyone has their own traditions and cultures. So I think, obviously at that time, technology wasn't very advanced, but I think ways that we can kind of prevent some of information getting lost in the future would just to be able to preserve some of the information from cemeteries a little bit better. Like if we're going to, I want to say destroy a cemetery or replace a cemetery, I think it should be important that we take things like the general ledger, for instance, and digitize that and kind of make that information accessible to people who are interested. And also I think it would be very cool if, for instance, this ledger says the lot number, the section, the grave, and we also have a map of and it went away, but we also have a map of the cemetery. So if we were able to overlay that map of the cemetery with, for instance, that person, so we can know, okay, this person was located here at the cemetery, and they were somewhere over here in this lot in this section. It doesn't mean anything since the cemetery is gone, but I think it would just be interesting to have, and it would, benefit people like me who research their family history and go back and try to find, little pieces of nuggets related to their ancestors. So that's essentially it. That's essentially the project. At the bottom of this, I have some additional examples of, other instances of this happening in the DC metro area. This same problem has happened in Florida. Obviously, it's like a nationwide thing, especially with Black cemeteries. And yeah, I already explained why this matters to me, and I also wanted to put out that there's bills trying to be passed to kind of preserve historic Black cemeteries, so that's a positive thing as well. But yeah, that's it.